Welcome everyone to our new books roundtable for unexpected parenting, prenatal testing, and Down syndrome. I'm Arden Hagley, Medical Humanities Fellow at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the coordinator of the Explorations in the Medical Humanities series and the Motherhood and Technology Working Group here at Columbia University. I am thrilled to host this high-octane panel tonight, and I look forward to a rich conversation. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to say a few quick words about our format tonight. We're all on a Zoom meeting, so please bear in mind everyone is visible. We've muted attendance, and we ask that you please remain muted during the presentation and that you turn your camera off. However, we ask that you turn your camera back on during the Q&A so that we feel as though we're having a real conversation. We look forward to hearing you actively participate in discussion. You can switch back and forth between speaker and gallery view as makes sense to you. And you can also pin our sign language interpreter if that makes a difference for you too. After the conversation, you can direct questions or comments to me, Arden Hagley, in the chat box, and I'll bring them up during the discussion. And this will follow presentations by each of our speakers. And we plan the whole event to last until about 7:30 tonight. So tonight we're gathered virtually to celebrate Unexpected Parenting, Prenatal Testing, and Down Syndrome, which is being published this month by NYU Press. We're also here to remember the author of the book, Alison Piepmeier. We'll be hearing more about Alison from her friends and colleagues, Rachel Adams and George Estreich, but I wanted to say a few words now. Alison Piepmeier was a scholar of feminism and disability studies, the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, where she was professor of English, and the mother of Maybelle, a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome. When she passed away in August 2016, she left behind an important unfinished manuscript about motherhood, prenatal testing, and disability. That manuscript is unexpected, and George Estreich and Rachel Adams pick up where she left off, honoring Alison's important research, as well as adding new perspectives to her work. In fact, Alison, Rachel, and George appeared together in a Heyman Center event in 2014 on parenting, narrative, and our genetic future. So it's very fitting that we should hold this event tonight to celebrate their co-authored book. So tonight we will be hearing first from Rachel and George, and then responses from Alondra Nelson and Cyantani Dasgupta, whom I'll introduce a little later. And while I'll let the co-authors give the real introduction to the book, I'll just say now that Unexpected offers revolutionary insight into the challenging terrains of reproductive choice, social stigma, and the ways in which prenatal testing contributes to a troubling understanding of Down syndrome. So as we celebrate the launch of this book, we're grateful tonight for the sponsorship of the Explorations in the Medical Humanities at the Societies of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Motherhood and Technology Working Group at the Center for the Study of Social Difference, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. So I'm delighted now to be able to introduce the panelists who helped to author this book. Rachel Adams is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She specializes in 20th and 21st century literatures of the United States and the Americas, disability studies and health humanities, media studies, theories of race, gender, and sexuality, and food studies. She's the author of Raising Henry, a memoir of motherhood, disability, and discovery, published in 2013 and winner of the 2014 Delta Kappa Gamma Educators Award. Her other books include Continental Divides, Remapping the Cultures of North America, and Sideshow USA, Freaks and the American Cultural Imagination. She is the co-author of the Keywords for Disability Studies, and she's written articles in virtually every major print publication. Adams recently received a Guggenheim Award to work on her new book, which is about care. George Estreich is a writer and poet living in Western Oregon with his family. He holds a BA from the University of Virginia and an MFA from Cornell, and he teaches at Oregon State University. Among his books are textbook illustrations of the human body, a collection of poetry that won the Gorstline Prize from Cloudbank Books, and The Shape of the Eye, a book about raising his daughter Laura, who has Down syndrome, which received the 2012 Oregon Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. Estreich has published essays and articles in the New York Times, the Oregonian, Avidly, the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, Salon, Tin House, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency. His new book, Fables and Futures, Biotechnology, Disability, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves, which came out from MIT Press, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award and was named a Best Science Book of 2019 by NPR's Science Friday. So we'll begin tonight by hearing from Rachel Adams and George Estreich. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Arden. And I also want to thank Kay Zhang and the other staff at the Hyman Center. They worked so hard to make this an accessible event, true to Alison's legacy. And if I seem to be speaking at a pace that sounds unnaturally slow, it's intended to allow the interpreters to keep up. And we've all been advised to speak at this pace. I want to express my gratitude to have two such esteemed colleagues as our respondents. Thanks so much to Alondra and Cyantani for helping us to honor Alison's legacy and work. It also means so much to see members of Alison's family in the audience, as well as so many friends and colleagues who supported George and I through this process. And then my greatest appreciation goes to my beloved co-editor, George Estreich. One of Alison's many lasting gifts was to facilitate our collaboration. I realize that most people listening in don't yet have access to a copy of this book. So I wanted to start by giving the briefest overview of Alison's work. The book is a series of essays on women's reproductive freedom, parenting, genetic technology, and disability justice. They combine personal narrative about Alison's experiences as the mother of a daughter with Down syndrome with more academic writing based on research that included interviews with other parents and disability advocates. George and I wrote the introduction and each contributed an additional chapter to the book. One challenge of inheriting Alison's unfinished project is that its subjects are so timely. Alison was great at responding to current events, moving easily between scholarship, public-facing essays, and advocacy. But this currency meant that by the time Alison's writing came to George and I, many of the issues that she took up had already evolved. Often I was frustrated by wanting to talk to her about how her ideas would have changed along with the times. So I decided to work with that frustration, writing my own chapter as a letter to Alison, a form that allowed me to address her directly, posing questions about how she might have responded to current events. This approach comforted me as I worked to finish Alison's book, and it now gives me some pleasure to think that she's with us here tonight. If not in some spiritual form, then certainly in the prolonged lifespan of her thought and writing. So I'll use my last minutes to share the most relevant questions I had for Alison. In studying parents of children with Down syndrome, Alison asked how prenatal genetic testing shaped experiences of pregnancy, family, and social life. But the lightning fast pace of technological development threatened to make her research seem outdated. At the time Alison and I were pregnant with our children with Down syndrome, they're 1 year apart, so this was roughly 2005, 2006, prenatal genetic tests weren't yet widely advertised, branded products. Direct-to-consumer genetic services were just starting to take off. And the revolutionary gene editing technology, CRISPR-Cas9, hadn't been introduced into the news cycle. I wanted to know how Alison would have understood these developments in terms of her own experience as a parent, that of her informants, and mothers coming along after their emergence. I also wonder how her research might have evolved as her daughter, Maybelle, grew up. Alison's research was motivated by personal experience. And I love how this book weaves Alison's life writing in and out of her scholarship. Given where she was in life, her work on disability tended to focus on pregnancy, childhood, parenting, and family. As Maybelle got older, how would her mother have addressed challenges of adolescence, sexuality, work, and aging for people with intellectual disabilities? Although largely concerned with parents, Alison also interviewed people with Down syndrome, whose words are included in the book. And I imagine they would have had an increasing role in her writing and advocacy. Finally, in my essay, I asked Alison about the differences between illness and disability. Obviously, these categories overlap, but I can't think of a more intense example of their divergence than the life of my friend, who thrived on parenting a thriving child with Down syndrome while suffering the indignities and pain of brain cancer. What would she have said about our current pandemic and how it has exposed policies of medical rationing that deem the lives of people with disabilities less worth saving? Over the past year, I've tried to channel Alison's wisdom while sheltering my 13-year-old son with Down syndrome, terrified that he might receive inferior treatment if infected. If there's anything hopeful in that, it is that so much of this book, written about once current events of almost a decade ago, is still timely to those of us living on in the present. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to echo Rachel's thanks to all of those who've worked to make this event possible. And my endless thanks also to Alondra Nelson and Cyantani Dasgupta for being here today to share this event with us. More gratitude. We want to thank Eileen Kalish and all of her team at NYU Press for their work in bringing this book from a manuscript to a finished book you can hold in your hand. I want to thank Alison's husband, Brian McGee, for his wisdom and support as we worked on this project. To acknowledge Alison's many friends who would take our entire session to name, and to acknowledge Alison's family, her parents, Lee and Kelly Piepmeier, her brother, Trey Piepmeier, and his partner, Olivia Miller, her brother, Aaron Piepmeier, Aaron's wife, Mary Piepmeier, and their daughter, Margot. And most of all, Alison's daughter, Maybelle Biffle Piepmeier, to whom this book is dedicated. And finally, I want to thank my dear friend, Rachel Adams. I am eternally grateful for your friendship and the experience of working together on Alison's book. In my early 20s, I wrote and published a sequence of poems, an elegy, for a friend who went missing and was never found. I've been thinking about that long ago project, now that Alison's book is out in the world, about the way we remember those we've lost and the way they inhabit our representations. If I bring it up now, it's to clarify something about the book that we are here to discuss today. Unexpected is many things, but it is not an elegy. Whatever forms the elegy may take, its boundaries are clear. It is about the dead, but it is by and for the living. In Unexpected, Rachel and I do write about Alison and her achievement, but our main goal was to let her speak for herself, to gather the best of her writing on this ambitious project, and to lend it continuity in keeping with her intentions, to show her as a scholar, an activist, and a writer, to share her vibrant, funny, learned, and accessible voice with those who might never have heard it. Alison was always ready to challenge her readers' assumptions. It's no surprise, then, that working on her manuscript challenged my own assumptions about writing. I'd always seen writing as a solitary endeavor, but Unexpected has been something new for me, a collaborative project. Most obviously, Rachel and I worked together to assemble and edit the draft from the materials Alison left us. Our work also grows out of our long-time collaboration with Alison. For years, both in informal conversations and formal presentations, we've been talking about disability, Down syndrome, parenting, prenatal testing, and illness. Unexpected bears the traces of those conversations, but it also stands for the conversations, public and otherwise, we did not get to have, the work we planned to do together. Rachel's essay in chapter 6 beautifully addresses this question of the unfinished. Her questions to Alison, by definition unanswered and unanswerable, suggest something important about this book. Though it is not an elegy, it is fueled by loss, and that loss is equally located in the past and the future. To grieve a fiercely intelligent and creative person like Alison is not just to miss who she was, it's to feel the absence of all she might have done. Of course, our collaboration has its limits. Unexpected is Alison's book. Our goal was to preserve and advance her vision, so our job entailed selection and assembly, not invention. We did not try to extrapolate the book Alison might have written, or to substitute our voices for her own. Our own perspectives are present in the jointly written preface and in individually written chapters that bear witness to Alison's achievement and to our affection for our friend. Which returns me to the question of friendship. And here too, writing this book was unlike any other I've worked on in its particular entanglement of the academic and the personal. For me, the ordinarily dry work of editing and research, of compiling Alison's published and unpublished work, of considering alternate versions of a passage, could be emotionally fraught. I'd read Alison's handwritten notes in the margins, her questions to herself, her speculations, and I'd feel the paradox of grief, the presence of absence, the palpable sense of the one who is gone. I'd wonder about Alison's intentions, and of course want to consult her. Where would you break this paragraph? Which alternate sentence would you choose? I'd suggest that this entanglement is not only a result of this project, but of disability itself. In the work of disabled writers, we see again and again that bodily facts give rise to abstractions, and abstractions are visceral in their effect. Entanglement is part of the deal. That may be why books about disability are so often multiple in their approach, bringing memoir and scholarship and critical analysis to bear, as Alison did here. We do not know what synthesis Alison might have arrived at, given enough time. Her book is necessarily open-ended. It suggests what might have been. It's my hope that readers will take that open-ended nature as an invitation, and that Alison's drive to connect, to question assumptions, and to raise the hardest questions will be the beginning of many conversations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, George. We're now thrilled to welcome Alondra Nelson and Cyantani Dasgupta, who will tell us about the impact of this book on the wider field, while also raising questions for our authors. So it's my pleasure to introduce them now. Alondra Nelson is a scholar of science, technology, and social inequality. She is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study and the president of the Social Science Research Council. Nelson is author most recently of The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, of Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, Genetics and the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History, and Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life. She is also the editor of Afrofuturism, an influential special issue of Social Text, and she is recently the Deputy Director for Science and Society for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we're delighted to have you take time to be with us tonight. Cyantani Dasgupta is a physician trained in pediatrics and public health. She teaches at Columbia University in the graduate program in narrative medicine, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. She writes and speaks on issues of gender, race, health, and social justice. Dasgupta is the author of several books, including The Principles and Practices of Narrative Medicine, with Rita Sharon and other authors, Stories of Illness and Healing, Globalization and Transnational Surrogacy in India, and Her Own Medicine, a memoir of field notes of her journey into medicine. Also a children's fantasist in the Academy, Dasgupta is the author of the New York Times bestselling Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond series. Please welcome Alondra Nelson and Cyantani Dasgupta.
Thank you so much, Arden, for the introduction. I just am overflowing with gratitude for this book and for this evening, for the opportunity to be reunited with my colleagues, Rachel Adams and Cyantani Dasgupta, who I miss very much from our time together as colleagues at Columbia. So, you know, I'm actually not going to talk about genetics, which I think would have been the obvious thing, because the book is so moving. I mean, I am just overflowing with just emotion, having read the book in the last week. It is truly a labor of love. About 2 decades ago, I attended a family friend's funeral in Oxford, England. And this gentleman was a member of the law faculty at Oxford. And as part of the funeral, his colleagues from the college that he was in put on their gowns and marched around the green. And it was, I remember thinking at that time, you know, in the American Academy, we don't do things like that for our colleagues. I just was struck by the kind of the ritual of it. You know, we have the Festschrift, of course, which is a tradition that, you know, is US and beyond, but to me, this is the kind of closest thing to that beautiful ritual, which the unique way in which colleagues can show love and give honor to other colleagues. To really dwell with the work for many years, as you did, to really try to understand the work. So much of certainly the early pages of the book are Rachel and George trying to help the reader understand their struggle to walk in Alison's intellectual shoes. And for me, it was a model for what it means to be a scholar and in a community of scholars, but also a lesson for life. And I think that the book is filled with so many incredible lessons for life. So I want to spend some time talking about those. The first is a metaphor that you use in the preface of a Japanese artistic form called kintsugi, K-I-N-T-S-U-G-I. So it's a Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. It's called golden seams or golden repair. And one mends breakage by adding lacquer and gold or silver to it. And I was struck by this powerful metaphor that George and Rachel chose to use because it was creating beauty out of letting the seams show. And I think for me, so much of what I took away from Unexpected was how Alison, one of the lessons she left for us is, and I think over the last year, for those of us, all of us living in this pandemic space, of not pretending that we live without seams and of letting the seams show. And I think also for us as scholars and writers, you really, and Alison allowed us to really explode the myth and the lie in some regards of the single genius author. So, none of us ever writes anything alone. But, this process in this book shows how it takes whole families and whole communities to create anything. So I was just a few, examples from the book. Alison's husband, helping her to finish a blog post and signing, adding some bracketed information to a blog post when she was taking ill. Alison's mother, Kelly, co-signing emails with her that they wrote together, and in her effort to help Alison communicate. The epistolary form that Rachel uses to communicate with Alison, that is the last chapter of the book, which gives form to, really what is the life of the mind and how we deal with colleagues. I mean, we are the sort of life of scholarship is, epistolary in some regards and always dialogic. And so, much as I think the last year for us has forced us to see all the things, the infrastructure that makes our life work. I think so much of the gift of Alison's book is letting all the seams show, through a kind of scholarly kintsugi that just shows what it takes to do what any of us accomplish as parents, as scholars, as people in community. And I just want to quote, I think and of course, friends finishing a book with you and for you is obviously an example of this. But I want to just end this point by quoting from the book. Rachel and George say, quote, "We do not claim to speak for Alison. We are her assistive technology." And I was also quite struck by that metaphor. And that would be a question I would want to ask, you all to think about, because that's quite a deliberate choice that, and I would love to hear more about that. I wanted to make another second point on page 23, Rachel writes, Alison writes a quote of wanting to radically reframe human worth. And, I think that's really what the book is about, from, George and Rachel as editors, but certainly Alison as a scholar, as a mother, and as an advocate. And in the context of the last year of COVID-19, of the treacherous triage of human life being executed, meant both ways, every day, that it's important, I think, to, carry forward that light of radically reframing human worth. And as Alison would want us to do, and as I took from her book, to understand that there are no tragic or imperfect humans, and that there are, and that we should value, or should endeavor to value, and maybe, I think one of the other life lessons for me from this book is that life's journey is to learn to value others just as they are, right? So what if we took that as like one of the missions of life, and not assume that it's not difficult and that it's not a process, but that life itself, one noble goal for life is that indeed. And then the last point I wanted to make was really about what I took from the book, from Alison's interviews and ethnography with mothers, mostly with parents with children with a Down syndrome, was a kind of mutual aid of parenting that I thought was just so profound, and that the mutual aid was in part about listening. It was in part about acknowledging the sort of uncertain temporality of caregiving, that that those roles can change quickly, that the sort of telos of reproduction, of pregnancy, of parenting, those temporalities that we've come to expect, and you reference in the book about crip time and queer time, and I think there's a lot of ways to think about that. But that part of this mutual aid of parenting, was about making visible all of these temporalities, and making them sort of okay, and giving sort of space to them. And the unexpected, so there's, of course, there's grief, there's pain, there's uncertainty in the unexpected, which is the book's title. And I guess one of the final kind of takeaways for me is that the unexpected is, a kind of temporality, and it is in addition to being a surprise, or that there's a temporality to surprise. And so certainly one of the things that I will be ruminating on for a very long time are all of the temporal sort of models and schema that Alison sort of leaves for us to really wrestle with, from genetic futures, utopic, dystopic, to predeceasing loved ones, to the way in which parenting and care work against, as I say, a kind of assumed telos for life. So I think there are, Alison left for us lots of profound, I think, questions and lots of profound observations. And I think, not answers, but that journey that I was suggesting earlier about the kind of constant sort of struggle to reframe human worth. So I want to just say, as I wrap up, George and Rachel, just how deeply moved I was by the book. I mean, I've never formally, I've never read anything quite like it, but just the fact of it, and the way that you narrate your way as collaborators together through the project is just stunning and meaningful. And I hope that those of us who are writers and scholars here, I think, for me, I can't come away from this work without wanting to take away the lesson that I think Alison would want us to have, which is that none of us do our work or live our lives alone, and we are richer for that and for this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Alondra, for those beautiful words. Can you hear me? This is for the interpreter, yes? Okay. So thank you so much for having me here today, Rachel and George, as well as Arden, Kay, and all the Heyman Center organizers. It's a delight to be here as well with my friend and colleague, Alondra Nelson, who I miss terribly. Thank you to our captioner and our sign language interpreters and everyone who has made such an effort to make this event accessible. In these times of isolation, I can't tell you what a delight it is to be in community, even if it's virtual, with friends and colleagues of the mind and heart. Thank you also, look at this beautiful picture, to Alison and Maybelle for your story, which I read not first and foremost as a scholar of illness and disability narratives, but as a fellow feminist parent, someone for whom this pandemic has really brought home a focus on my own intimate relationships and made me ask myself what it means to accompany young people on their journeys into the world. If you haven't, for instance, read the book yet, please make note of the part where Alison and Maybelle are dancing in the living room. Read it and then read it again. So my response today is going to be along two threads, two things I'd like to know more about. One from Rachel and George, one about representation itself, and one about reproduction. But these, of course, intersect and intertwine, and we can even use the word reproduction when we mean representation, right? They're all mixed up in there. But let me begin just by wondering aloud about the politics of representation. In other words, what does it mean to speak for or with another? These are the questions, as Alondra points out, that George and Rachel ask themselves with that beautiful metaphor, right, of the gold in the cracks in the beginning of Unexpected. And they also invoke the notion of interdependence, which is such an important resistance to ableist formulations of autonomy. And let me just say as an aside, may we all earn ourselves friends like Rachel and George in the course of our lives, who can so uplift together our personal and academic strengths. So when I teach in the program in narrative medicine at Columbia, I ask my graduate students to think, what does it mean to speak for another? What does it mean to represent another? Particularly, so remember, I teach in this program called narrative medicine. As someone who works in a program that makes central the power of human stories, I've been really wondering over the last few years if there's a potential tyranny in narrative. Is the demand for storytelling always just? Is there, or can there be, in particular instances, a kind of power, a resistance in opacity, in not telling, particularly for individuals from marginalized identities? Tom Couser, C-O-U-S-E-R, whose work on disability memoirs is cited in Unexpected, talks about disability memoirs being somebody memoirs, the life stories of what Rosemary Garland Thompson would call extraordinary bodies. So disability scholars like Kauser and Thompson write about the able-bodied world's voyeuristic demands to know what happened to you, right? What's your story? As if visible disability removes any protections of privacy between an individual with disabilities or their family and the world. And in the face of this demand, and this happens to people from many marginalized identities, right? There's this voyeuristic demand to know from people you don't even know. And in the face of this demand, can it be an empowerment to both tell one story, right? And define the parameters of what that means and own it in a sense, but also simultaneously choose not to tell. And I know this seems like a funny question to bring up as we're celebrating a book that's already been written, but we can ask ourselves, even in the context of this beautiful book, what things did Alison or Rachel or George choose not to tell, right? What stories are not for public consumption? And of course, Alison also deepens this concern about representation because, as she notes, there are additional layers of questions when it's the parent or a family member of an individual with disabilities telling the story. Tom Kauser, in fact, starts an essay called Making, Taking, and Faking Lives, the Ethics of Collaborative Life Writing. So that's the title. Making, Taking, and Faking Lives, the Ethics of Collaborative Life Writing, with a quote from Malcolm X. Whose book is this? And unexpected demands that we ask the same question. Whose book is this? And I think, as Alondra has gestured, that answer goes far beyond kind of constructions of individual identity to kind of communal identities. Kauser goes on in that same essay to draw from Wayne Booth, B-O-O-T-H, Wayne Booth's questions about the scope of fiction, and applies them to collaborative life writing. He says, what are the author's responsibilities to those whose lives are used as material? What are the author's responsibilities to others whose labor is exploited to make the work of art possible? And what are the responsibilities of the author to truth? And so the question I come to with this text that I write, all similar sorts of text, is what does it mean to represent across power differentials, right? In situations like Alison describes, where able-bodied parents tell stories or integrate stories of their children into their own writing, their children with disabilities into their own writing. But it's a question that remains across multiple other sorts of power differentials as well. It's a question I imagine George and Rachel have grappled with, and I'd love to hear about in their own writings beyond the scope of this book, but also within the scope of this book. The question of friendship. What does it mean to collaborate as friends, to finish the story of one who can no longer contribute or push back on that collaboration? I'm not sure there are fixed and fast answers, but Rachel and George have clearly discussed and deeply thought about these questions themselves. And I'd love to hear kind of how those discussions went. So I'd love to hear their thoughts on any and all of these questions: the politics of representation, the power of opacity, or the ethics of collaborative life writing. And the other thread that I'm curious about further exploring this evening is one that was obviously very close to Alison's heart, that of reproductive politics, and specifically reproductive justice. It just happens to be this semester, I'm teaching a new class. I'm actually teaching Alondra's beautiful book, Body and Soul, a new class called Abolition Medicine, Medical Racisms and Anti-Racisms. And I've been teaching this seminar in the context of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, which has revealed so many deep-rooted health inequalities in this country, inequities in this country. And in the wake, of course, of this past summer's protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd and our country's ongoing horrors of anti-Black police violence. In this course, I've been teaching and thinking a lot about eugenics and the way that our history in this country, as well as the history of my own original profession, medicine, is so deeply entangled in eugenic ideals. I've been thinking a lot about this after teaching different case studies about how Black, Latinx, Indigenous folks with disabilities have been systematically sterilized without their consent, right? Deep into the 20th century. I've been thinking about the continuity of these practices in settings of incarceration and border detention, as well as group home and care settings for folks with disabilities. And these notions, right, come from this idea of somehow constructing an ideal, read white, able-bodied citizenry through limiting reproduction of certain folks. If not outright constructing healthcare and police infrastructures that preferentially harm marginalized people. And it's been present in this country for the last 100 or so years in active form. You know, of course, we need only remember that eugenics movements in the US and the UK were what inspired Nazi Germany, not the other way around. And even in the present day, eugenics gives us context to think about COVID do not resuscitate orders targeting individuals with disabilities. We can think about the way that health injustice plays itself out through which communities are both harder hit by COVID and yet in recent weeks have had the slowest rollout of vaccine accessibility and, you know, been the slowest to receive immunizations. Think about the outright way that the last president embraced what he called racehorse theory of people and told mostly white crowds at his ubiquitous rallies that they had good genes, right? I really think that this idea of making America great again is in many ways a cry for a nostalgic eugenic dream, right? A white, able-bodied, heteronormative, patriarchal that may or may not have actually existed, right? And I think that although Alison doesn't frame her discussion around eugenics per se, doesn't name it per se, it is deeply, there in her discussions about reproductive choice and the pressures of prenatal testing and the way that reproductive choice must be carefully framed to create room for individual pregnant people to choose what makes the most sense for them vis-a-vis pregnancy or termination. But then, as this book importantly points out, to be supported emotionally, socially, politically in those choices, right? Reproductive justice is about being able to have children or not, but it's really also about being able to raise the children we do have in health and without fear. I was struck how much some of Alison's discussions of these issues dovetailed with work of women of color around reproductive justice. You know, Rachel, you asked Alison questions in that last chapter. I want to ask her about how organizations like Sister Song might resonate in her work, right? Organizations which remind us that to achieve reproductive justice, we have to analyze power systems, address intersecting oppressions, center the most marginalized, and join together across issues and identities. And so I think I'll leave that at there, but before I kind of sign off, I just want to gesture to all the people who are no longer with us in this country, but have still so deeply contributed to us as people and to our conversations moving forward in our communities of scholarship and friendship. It's particularly powerful to be reading the words of Alison in her absentia today, this year, and remember all that we've lost and all who we've lost in this terrible year of grieving for our entire world. So I just wanted to quote George, who in a beautiful 2006 essay about Alison in LA Review of Books wrote the following: "Grief is a black hole, a gravity well, but it's a category error to grieve for loved ones who are here, to dwell on absence, ignoring the warmth and light of the burning present. I've learned a lot from my friend. I'm still learning." So I think I'll just say thank you to George and Rachel and Alison and Maybelle for this beautiful book, and allow room for discussion and reaction. And I thank you all deeply for allowing me to enter this important discussion.
Thank you, Alondra, and thank you, Cyantani, for your remarkable comments. I'd like to invite Rachel and George to take up some of the respondents' comments and questions now before we turn to audience Q&A.
George, do you want, I'll say something first since I unmuted. Thank you both so much. I'm just incredibly moved by your responses, and I can't think of a better way to honor Alison's memory. I'm actually going to respond to, because I don't want to take up too much time. So I'm going to respond to Cyantani's last point, kind of intersecting also with Alondra's point about you just left us with the beautiful sense that Alison reminds us that we need to think about why all lives are worthwhile. And then maybe George will want to speak to the questions about autobiography and ethics. But I had the luxury of getting Cyantani's comments in advance, and seeing her last question prompted me to look back at some of Alison's other writing outside of the book, because I remembered her as such a fierce advocate against oppressions of all kinds. And the book focuses primarily on women, people with disabilities, and reproductive rights. But I found one of her later articles in the Charleston City paper, where she was a regular columnist. This was after she was already quite sick. She had, because her photo, she's had her hair cut off, which she had to do in order to have surgery. She was out there. There had been one of the far too many police shootings of an unarmed Black man in Charleston. And she was writing in support of a group of activists who had gone out in protest and had been arrested. And she was out there in the streets with them. And it was a piece, a short essay that was all about the importance of alliances and forming solidarities across different interest groups. And I thought about that essay and that work a lot as the Black Lives Matter movement intersected with the pandemic this summer. And I think Alison would have so appreciated your questions and comments, because I think they are precisely in the spirit of the book and the work that she did.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, I wanted to first thank you, Alondra. Thank you, Cyantani, for your incredible thoughts and contributions. I'm so glad that this is recorded because there's stuff I want to go back to. Specifically, the phrase "mutual aid of parenting" I'm going to be thinking about for quite some time. I really love that. Two things, I guess, as was probably clear from my written piece, I come at this as a writer. I kind of describe myself as a poet who wandered out of his enclosure, and that's kind of what I am. But so hearing Alondra's points made me realize how what Alondra is sharing as a writer and a scholar dovetails perfectly with my understanding of imaginative writing, which is to say, the idea of letting the seams show, of imploding the myth of single genius and merging different kinds of knowing into one place. To me, that is, specifically what the essay does, but that can be the work of imagination. That's not like some separate scholarship thing, that these can all go together. And of course, Alondra, your point about radically reframing human worth, that is exactly what Alison wanted to do. And I think many people have that goal. What really made Alison stand out was her ability to talk to anyone, not with the pretense of objectivity that she didn't have a views. She had very strong views, but that she would just listen open-mindedly. If she disagreed with you, she'd say so. If she agreed with you, she'd say so. There are some writers in this book where she will say, I really don't like the way they talked about Down syndrome here, but this is absolutely valuable. She didn't dismiss other people as figures. She really listened. And so I think to the extent that Rachel and I, writing was an act of attention, we were really modeling that on Alison's practice. To Cyantani, I read this beforehand, and I have so much to say. Thank you, Cyantani, for these thoughts. I mean, and specifically on the question of COVID, for me, Down syndrome specifically has always been a site of intense contradiction. People with Down syndrome are seen as good-natured and as examples of bad nature, and COVID just reveals that contradiction. Like Oregon, due to some very serious activist work, has prioritized people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to get the vaccine. Oregon, my small blue college town, is also the town where, as was reported on NPR, a man with intellectual and developmental disabilities was brought in with a high fever. This was earlier last year. And the doctor said in front of him and his attendants that he didn't want to waste the PPE on doing a test. So the extremes of kind of ableism, and yet this kind of idea like, hey, these lives are valuable, they're not less valuable, coexist. And I think Alison was very alive to that. And so she could really show that without blunting or that binary or trying to resolve it. So anyway, thank you both for your lovely responses.
So Rachel and George, if you're both ready, we can move on to questions from the audience. So the first question I've received is from Rosemary Garland Thompson. And she's asking if you're familiar with the recent Atlantic cover story about families and people with Down syndrome in Denmark. What do you think about the work of the article? And a reminder to everyone, feel free to chat at me directly with your questions as we're speaking.
Oh, and Arden, may we see people's faces, or how does that work?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for inviting people to do that. I was so enthusiastic about getting into questions that I forgot to invite people to unmute their video.
No, because here I am quoting people to themselves. I'd love to. I like quoted George to George. I quoted Rosemary to Rosemary.
So I'm thrilled that people are unmuting their video. It's great to see your faces. So Rosemary asks about the recent Atlantic cover story about families and people with Down syndrome in Denmark. So George and Rachel, do you have any response to that?
I can, should I go, Rachel? Do you want me to go? Yeah. I thought it was a really good article. You know, overall, I especially in the Atlantic, where a lot of people are going to see it, I thought it was a smart decision to talk about Denmark and to sidestep the riven abortion politics of the United States and instead talk about the experience of parenting and how people are or are not valued. So I thought it was a good article. You know, I mean, you could have a symposium just on that. You know, I don't know if Rachel has anything to add, but that's just my quick first take.
I would just chime in. I thought it was a fine article. I mean, there's been a lot of articles about this and the, you know, vanishing people with Down syndrome. So there was nothing new in that article. What I said to my students was, you know, let's remember that Denmark, and I apologize to any Danish people if I'm making generalities, but I think of Denmark as a relatively homogenous and wealthy country where it's possible to have one policy for the nation. That's not a harbinger of what's happening in the world, and certainly not in a place as diverse as the United States. So people with Down syndrome are not going anywhere. The real problem that the article mentions but doesn't foreground is the problem of demographic shifts, where it becomes either a privilege to have a child because you can afford to support them, or even worse, that children who are devalued are born to women who don't have access to reproductive health care or to the resources they need to then care for those children. And so then those are exactly the groups who are not able to advocate on behalf of the needs of those communities. So that's what I would say is the issue that I care about most underlying that article.
Thank you. The next question is from Amy Reed. And her question is whether George and Rachel feel that Alison had a philosophy of advocacy, particularly how she might articulate her vision of advocacy as working either in tandem or in tension with academic scholarship.
Oh my gosh, George, do you want to talk about the welcome table? That's such a beautiful question, Amy.
Amy, yes, nice to see you. Thank you for that question. How should I answer this? Yes, I would say there are probably people more qualified to answer about Alison's philosophy of advocacy, but I will say that what was true for many parents of children with disabilities was especially true for Alison, which is to say, the theory was never enough. She was about the result. So it was, you know, it was not enough to say, okay, well, we've settled on the, you know, proper term for this subcategory of disability, you know, job done. Like she wanted to know, what classroom is this person in, you know? So I would say insofar as narrative was concerned, Alison was not only concerned about the abstract though she was incredibly fluent and brilliant in those worlds in the philosophy of disability. But that had to contact and inform advocacy, the result. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my sense of hers. And just in terms of that book, that is reflected in the form of this book, which contains theory, literary criticism, Alison thinking through these issues, and also her narrative of, life with Maybelle, of getting Maybelle into the school that she wanted to and how happy she was in that moment. Yeah, so holistic. Rachel, did I do it? You want to add? You should add something.
That was great. I just would say that I think Alison was always an advocate first, and she used her scholarship for advocacy. And one of the challenges I had as a scholar, I think I would say that I'm probably a scholar first. So when confronted with this book, sometimes my frustration was that Alison wanted to advocate, and because of that, she sometimes didn't want to wrestle with the disagreements among critics or to read something critically. And so in letting her voice come through, I sometimes had to subordinate that part of myself, and came to have such deep admiration for that. I mean, Alison was the person who wanted to change the world. She didn't want to make the best and logical argument. She wanted to change the world.
The question for all writing is the who cares question. Like, why does this writing matter in the first place? Like, why does it matter that it's out in the world? And Alison always knew. She knew why she was writing this, and that's what gave it urgency. It wasn't like, I'm trying to finish this book because that's like what you do at this stage in my career. I mean, she believed it and she lived it. So
we have a question from Amanda Apgar, who says she loved Cyantani's provocation. Whose book is this? She's writing a book on parent memoirs and is working with this question. And she'd like to hear Rachel and George and Cyantani speak more on this, on how we think about power and life writing.
I will say something. I did, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for that question, because I did have a response to Cyantani's question, but I didn't want to take up too much time earlier. So thank you for this opportunity. I would like to answer that question in two ways. First of all, in regard to Alison's book, which I would not categorize as a parental memoir. Now, parental memoirs are under a lot of fire in the disability community. Asking questions that are appropriate to ask about, what rights parents have to speak on behalf of their disabled children. I don't think Alison actually does that in this book. She talks about experiences that she has together with Maybelle, but she's not representing Maybelle's voice or her intentions. So I would argue that this book it's something different. Now, I also feel like that was a question to George and I, because we both wrote memoirs about our children with Down syndrome. And so this is a question that has certainly come up for me, and it's one that I have thought about a lot. I take very seriously the critiques that come from those in critical race studies and in disability studies, that there are long and terrible histories of speaking on behalf of the voiceless, on, you know, appropriating their voices to your own ends. I recognize those histories. I also think when it comes to people with disabilities who may not simply be figuratively voiceless or deprived of a voice because of political circumstances, but quite literally not having a voice that can be heard in a political arena, that it is more important ethically to speak for them and with them than to not have them speak at all. And I think personally, and this may be a controversial view, going back to the politics of interdependency that both Alondra and Cyantani brought up, that those of us who are most interdependent with others with disabilities are the ones who are not just who are, it is our duty to speak on behalf and with them. And I would say it's more of a speaking with than a speaking for. But that's how I explain my work as a writer, a parent writer, writing about my son. I don't think that Alison does that in the book. And I invite you all to read the very respectful way that she writes about her experiences with Maybelle, and filled with joy. And it's truly one of the more wonderful parts of the book.
Yeah, just to add to what Rachel says too, I mean, a significant part of the book is Alison's study of existing parent memoirs, and particularly, so I think Alison was more concerned with parents advancing an unduly tragic narrative. And she was, what's remarkable is how balanced she is. Like, she'll say, you know, I get that there's a glimmer of light at the end, but, you know, really, you know, 199 pages of darkness and one of light, you know, maybe we can change this a little bit. But Alison was very attuned to those. And of course, Rachel and I have faced those too. As you know, my own daughter, Laura, is 20 now. So things that I can now ask her if I write, it's like, is this cool? Yes, no. She says, no, I don't do it. You know, when children are younger, and if there's an intellectual disability, it is harder to do that. But this, again, going back to the point I made about in response to Alondra, is that these are not these are and are not specialized questions for writing about disability. These are simply questions about writing. And when I teach creative nonfiction at the graduate level, we face ethical questions all the time. How do you write about someone who's gone? How do you write about a loved one? How do you write about someone who disagrees with your version? And the thing I always say is there is no algorithm. There's no easy way to sort this out. But I want to thank Amanda also for that question. That's a really key question for this book.
A question from Alyssa M, which I think really picks up beautifully on this conversation. What strategies do you use for getting your colleagues in academia to listen to the voices of self-advocates, especially ones who aren't, quote, well-spoken? How do you convince them to listen to words that aren't polished or communication that isn't words?
I'm assuming we mean it's the, no, you're not talking about colleagues who are not well spoken.
There's going to be those too, but go on.
I don't know. This is, for me, this is an interesting question. It has been kind of humbling, like writing stuff about Laura and then, you know, having Laura do her own advocacy now. And so one strategy is get out of the way. I mean, the thing that I'm sure many people on this Zoom are familiar with, the saying, nothing about us without us. You know, it's like when you know, when you ask what my strategy is, it's when possible to get out of the way. So, but also to going, as you said, Arden, that connects to the previous question, which is, you know, acknowledging the fact that when you are speaking for / with on behalf of, acknowledging that that is happening to give more agency to the person you want to, you know, really be center stage. Rachel?
I think that was a good answer.
Great. All right, so then we will pick up with a question from Jordana Mendelson, which is on care. And Jordana offers a quotation from a recent paper called Radical Care, Survival Strategies for Uncertain Times. And I'm going to put the reference into the chat in a moment. But Jordana says, if there's time, I'd like to hear what Rachel and George think about this, how mutual aid parenting might be considered less in personal and parental terms and more in terms of community and the social. So here's the quotation that stood out. Theorized as an affective connective tissue between an inner self and an outer world, care constitutes a feeling with, rather than a feeling for, others. When mobilized, it offers visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservation that span a breadth of localities, selves, communities, and social worlds. So I'd love to hear your responses to that. And I can put it into the chat too.
I would say Rachel is the one who's writing a book on care.
Yes. I want to say, first of all, hello to Jordana, who is part of our wonderful talk about mutual aid societies. Alondra, part of my New York parents of children with Down syndrome community. And it means so much to have her here tonight. And she is also just the world's expert on caregiving. So I wish you were up there. Is that quote from Leah Pipenza? So, no. Okay. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I have two thoughts. On the one hand, it sounds like a beautiful sentiment. And what I take from it is, first of all, the need to recognize that we all need care, as well as being able to give it, so that caregivers also need care, and that caregiving relationships are mutual. At the same time, now I'm talking about my own work, although I feel that Alison might have gone in this direction if she had continued with her scholarship, that it's all fine and good to talk about networks of care and support, but in the absence of proper resources of the kind that Cyantani alluded to when she talked about reproductive justice, it really doesn't mean anything. And so one of the biggest problems that faces the parents of people with Down syndrome in this country is a terrible hypocrisy, where we don't want women to terminate pregnancies because they are prejudiced against carrying a disabled fetus. And at the same time, we don't provide them with the resources they need to support those children. And you can have all the good feelings in the world in your community, and if you don't have resources and you don't have access to healthcare and inclusive education, then that care really doesn't mean anything. So I'm not sure if that is part of the larger article that Jordana quoted from, but that's a point that I want to make, that the two things have to go together.
Can I just add on to that too, because I want to bring that back around to what Cyantani was saying about the tyranny of narrative, and which is a critical point. And so we all, you know, Rachel and I and Alison, of course, think about narrative. It was a key idea for Alison, but the thing is that, as Rachel says, there are things beyond narrative too. So even if that goodwill is there in the community, if the systems aren't there, if robust systems of care aren't there, it you know, I won't say it doesn't matter, it does matter, but narrative is insufficient. So I think that my broader insight on all this is that it is very important to talk about language, what words we use, what narratives we bring to disability, but those bring us up to the shore of practices which affect daily lives. And, you know, those of us, you know, those are things that you just depend on a community, on a government, because you can't build them.
If I could just jump in there, I mean, George made a point that I was thinking about, more of a kind of a sociological point, which is that, you know, yes, of course, we want, you know, everyone should be able to speak, and in whatever modality, you know, that they're able to articulate themselves, and that should be, you know, taken up and, you know, and dialogue and re-articulated. But I feel like the care that ethical care work also requires a kind of brutal honesty about, you know, that certain utterances don't travel to certain places. And, you know, to me, that is the kind of, you know, tension of it. That's, you know, to sort of layer that onto the tension or the hypocrisy that Rachel raised. So I just wanted to, you know, as someone who writes about social movement actors, I mean, I think one of the lessons for me is both the kind of realpolitik and the utopian, and like kind of, you know, having to like kind of deal with those in the face of each other, kind of fairly constant in the work.
Thank you. I think we have time for about one more question. And I wanted to follow up on something that Rob Wilson had mentioned in the chat as a comment to everyone, and Rosemary has picked this up too, about the point that Cyantani raised around eugenics. And Rob says stories, especially video stories, can play a powerful role in shifting views about eugenics and nugenics. Some of these stories from both eugenics survivors and people parenting with disability in Canada can be found under our stories at eugenicsarchives.ca. And Rob is wondering about panelists' views on questions of representation, voice, community, and perspective in that kind of resource.
Well, earlier when somebody asked the question about how do you get your colleagues to listen to the voices of people who are less able, and George gave a very eloquent answer, so I kind of gave up my own response, but I would have said something along those lines, that I do think that that access to a variety of media that can allow people with different kinds of voices to be represented is extremely important for democratizing representation and allowing their voices to be heard. And, you know, much as technology remains limited, it also has greatly enhanced the ability of different kinds of people to speak. So I think that's another way that Alison's work might have branched out, is to speak beyond print texts to texts in a wider variety of media. And as she increasingly sought to hear the voices of people with Down syndrome and other disabilities, I think she would very likely have gone in that direction.
Yeah, just a small example to add on to that is the oral history work of Nikki Berger, whom we know, which is both includes audio and video, and is a great example for, expanding beyond the kind of the standard of polished, beautiful prose to any modality that people can use to express themselves and to move others.
All right, so it's time for us to adjourn this evening. Many thanks to all of you for this extraordinarily rich conversation, and I'm so glad that you joined us to celebrate the launch of Unexpected. I only wish we could have seen one another in person tonight. So thank you once more to our 4 speakers tonight: Rachel Adams, George Estreich, Alondra Nelson, and Cyantani Dasgupta, and of course, Alison Piepmeier for writing the book. I also would like to thank the staff of the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities for producing the event, and to the Office of Disability Service, to Mary and Cassandra from the National Captioning Institute, and to our 2 ASL interpreters, Carly James and Maria Cardoza, for their work tonight. We wish everyone well for a safe and healthy rest of the week. You can buy the book. The link is available and in the chat and also on the slide here. I hope many of you do. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us.